Ladies and gentlemen, we're back today with Alan Mills, Ph.D. He is a Ph.D. in political science. He's gone to school in Ireland. He's gone to school in Canada. He's been all over the world, spent time in Asia. Interesting guy, wonderful human being. How are you today, Alan?
I'm very well, thank you.
Yeah. Where are you coming to us from?
I'm coming from Winnipeg, Manitoba, Canada. And it's a sort of rainy day here.
Is it always sort of cold there?
Yes, it's one of the coldest cities in the world. It makes us very, very strong, although sometimes you feel that you're actually part of the proletariat of the world because you haven't found a way of escaping Winnipeg.
Yeah. Well, when you're a part of the proletariat, it's good to have a refrigerator that's outside. You don't need to plug into electricity. You can just...
Exactly. Yes.
So when we say proletariat, obviously Alan Mills here, he's an expert on political science, but also an expert in socialism, which is a very hot topic right now. People are really trying to get their hands on socialism, try to figure out what it is. So just in a nutshell, again, tell us why socialism, the evolution of you becoming interested in sort of justice for everyone.
Well, I suppose it happened when I was at university in Dublin. I had some very influential professors, one particularly a fellow called David Thornley, a very dynamic speaker as well. And it set me thinking about the idea of socialism as the one true way to justice. I joined the Northern Ireland Labour Party for a short while, and then I came to Canada. And I eventually gravitated to write a thesis about a sort of centre-left liberal socialist review called the Canadian Forum. The Canadian Forum in the period in the 1920s and early 30s, when a kind of socialism is taking hold and forming and being shaped in Canada. And so, that's really been my interest. I suppose intellectually I believe in socialism. What I find difficulty with, though, is the idea about how you actually bring it about in the real world. You can talk about equality, and equality not just of rights, but equality of resources and housing and material circumstances. That, I think, is one of or several of the important parts of socialism. But how you get it in the very complicated society we live in it seems to me, the big question. But anyway, I haven't lost my interest in the left, particularly in Canada. And so almost all my academic work, the research anyway, has been in regards to, thinking about different kinds of parts of Canadian socialism.
Now, historically, has there been a push and pull from, more conservative people with conservative ideologies pushing back on socialists?
You mean in general in Canada, or what?
Yeah, historically in Canada.
Well, I mean, I think, if you want to think about what we call the political culture of Canada, it is mainly what I would call a mix of conservatism and liberalism. These, of course, are loaded terms, and they're often very, very elastic terms, but let's just say this. The non-socialist traditions of conservatism and liberalism have tended to predominate in Canada, but growing in the interwar years, I think we've seen the emergence of a version of socialism or different versions of socialism. And I think the effect of that has been in the present that, Canada has a functioning, permanent left-wing party called the New Democratic Party. It holds power in British Columbia. It's a minority party within the Canadian Parliament, but it is working with the existing Liberal government to provide a kind of informal coalition. And one of the things it's negotiated with the Liberal government is the introduction of free dental care for kids under 12 years old. So there's a new initiative that, if you like, is the result of the influence of the NDP. Is it complete socialism? Well, no, but it's a piece of what you would think would be a socialist society.
I would always vote. I would say vote toothpaste and toothbrushes for everybody. Just as a basic socialist concept. Let's just and floss. Throw in the floss. I think that's pretty brilliant. So, is there any data to back up that this program of free dental worked better than maybe a for-profit model?
Well, this is an interesting question because dental care in Canada, by and large, is provided by private providers. And I must say, from using the dental system, I'm like a lot of British people. I have very bad teeth. The effects of too much sugar in childhood, too much the results of cheap sugar from the empire.
Right.
The empire fights back.
Imperialist sugar, you.
The empire fights back and it ruins your teeth. Okay. But the point I think is that while we have a fairly good private dental system in this country, if you don't have the money to pay for it, then you often don't get the care. It's like the United States and its medical system. If you don't have insurance and you don't have the money, then you by and large can't afford it. So it's really a distributive issue about making sure that, if you like, public monies are provided to families to provide then dental care for their kids. I suspect it's provided on a means-based basis. Now, the program is only being implemented as we speak, but it's just an illustration of how it is that, if you like, socialism, while never being a majoritarian movement yet in Canada, it nonetheless has had significant influence on other political parties. When then, for example, I did the book on Woodsworth, the first leader of Canada's Socialist Party, he was a member of Parliament in the 1920s, and there was a moment when his vote was necessary to sustain the government of the day, and he negotiated with the Prime Minister and said, "I'll support you if you introduce a program of old age pensions." So that kind of bargaining about specific issues has been the way, at least federally, the left has basically behaved and tried to, if you like, make progress towards socialist ideals. But of course, Canada is like, I suppose, most European societies, a mainly free enterprise capitalist society. But there is a large state that has built up a fairly significant welfare state. So we have, in some ways, a kind of Keynesian mixed economy. Much private enterprise, but some public enterprise too.
Yeah, and in comparison to a place like America, though, leaning more left in the sense of social safety nets and things like that.
I think so, although, in some ways, the United States, in strange ways, has a kind of safety net of sorts. It's just that it has lots of holes, doesn't it? Social Security, Medicaid, some states, do they still have free university tuition? Does California still have it still? I don't know.
No, I think...
But there are little bits. The left wing of the Democratic Party would be then your version of socialism.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Well, we have the moderates, and then we have what they call the radicals, which is Bernie Sanders, who would be for the healthcare that you guys have in Canada, and just sort of kind of model ourselves after you. But we can't quite get our hands on the reins of the Democratic Party.
Right. But what's very interesting about Canada is that since the mid-1960s, we have had a national, we call it Medicare system, that is, in a sense, almost a completely public system. Patients do not have to pay for anything, and it's on a kind of equal universal basis, which is a huge, sign of progress compared to what they have in the United States, as you know.
Yeah.
And that came from that little socialist party that won power in Saskatchewan, of all places, in 1944. And one of the things it eventually did was introduce then this idea of Medicare. And then in the 1960s, the Liberals took up the idea and introduced it nationally. And it is now that we have that from coast to coast. And even though it is that provinces administer the Medicare system, they are locked into essentially a public system.
Good.
They try, if there's liberal or conservative governments in power, to introduce more privatization. But by and large, there's been pretty well significant resistance to that. It's always a political issue when they try to do it.
Do you listen to news from back home in Great Britain? Do you know that is it the same story, or are they always trying to kind of smear the NHS and sort of try to take it away from people? Or
I think so. I think it's always, in some senses, the victim of a certain kind of right-wing propaganda. I mean, it's been difficult for the NHS, as it's called, because, of course, it bore the brunt of the pandemic and COVID and that kind of thing. Yeah. People are demoralized, nurses, doctors, ambulance drivers. They've worked very, very hard, and I think they're feeling very, very low.
Yeah.
Now, the interesting thing about the British system is that it does allow private medicine if you want to pay it. If you want to pay for private medicine in Canada, you have to go out of the country pretty well. There are a few little exceptions here and there. A certain kind of procedures are available privately. But, if I want to get a hip replacement and I can't get it on time here, I have to go to Mexico or the United States or possibly Germany. I don't know.
Well, I would say Germany is probably your best bet, but so when people get private insurance in a place that already has such decent public insurance, is the treatment that much better?
Well, the treatment that you get in the public system, I think, in Canada is pretty good. I mean, it's not a inferior technical service.
Right.
The problem is that, the problem is a big problem. The question is how you pay for it. By and large, people want a perfect medical system, publicly provided, and they want as well to pay low taxes. And so it seems to me always the public system is never financed sufficiently to provide a completely efficient arrangement. So there are wait lists, and especially after COVID, there are long wait lists. So there's a kind of sort of scarcity situation. And that, of course, leads to criticism of the system. But once you get in the system, the service is very, very good.
Yeah. So it's talking about socialism and capitalism and this constant ebb and flow within most Western countries. Are there things that private enterprise actually does better where maybe we couldn't use socialism because it would be inefficient?
Well, I mean, I as well as being intellectually a socialist, I think I can say that of myself. Practically, I'm a sort of pragmatist. And that is to say, I'm not sure whether, pretty well the whole economy should be provided by way of public institutions. Would you want the car industry, if you believe in a car industry, to be provided by the state? There are many competitors, it seems to me, in the global car industry. Mm-hmm. I mean, even in Germany, there are at least 4, 5, 6, 7 different companies, are there not?
Yeah.
Now, would you want, because you're a socialist, that it be provided by a publicly owned corporation? I think not.
Well, this comes into like, does competition? Sometimes we get monopolies, and then the competition kind of dries up. But but if there is competition between car companies, for example, that the beneficiaries will be the public at large. But yeah, if you had a socialist car company, how bland and horrible would these cars be, or could be? I mean, they could be great. Who knows?
Well, yes.
But
let me put it this way. I am not a believer in complete public ownership. Now, that maybe doesn't make me a very good socialist. I think, for example, that competition is an important principle. Initiative in the development of the economy is an important principle. The worry about publicly owned companies has to be that sometimes they are wasteful, too much driven by political considerations. I've just read in one of the English newspapers about the scandal of where so many billions of dollars of oil money has disappeared in Venezuela.
Oh, interesting.
That great beacon of socialism, all right? Yes, no, I mean, if we think of a socialist country, it has to be one of them has to be Venezuela. And yet they're worrying now about where something like, I don't know, $10 billion worth of oil money, oil royalties has somehow gone amiss.
Well, on the flip side, corporate malfeasance is also, and banker malfeasance is also something
absolutely
we have to deal with.
Yes, of course. Well, bigness has its problems. Yes.
Yeah.
Private and public. But the point is to make the case that because something is public, it is therefore virtuous and always virtuous, isn't necessarily the case. So, I'm a skeptical socialist, and I think that living in the here and now, you have to make some sort of tough, realistic choices about what to support.
So you're saying if you have, you can have socialism, but what you need to be looking out for is like authoritarianism, and also, just big groups, big inefficient organizations.
Yes, I think that's right. Yeah, I think that's right.
That's good. I'll agree with that. I'm a younger, more radical, angry, socialist, but I have to agree with you. Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, I think we all live in a real world which is immediate and presses in on us, where we have to make tough choices, because in some senses the world is always, as we confront it, a world of scarcity. We can't have everything at the same time or all at once. And so you have to think about priorities, how you choose, trade-offs and things like that. I've been very, very interested in politics. I've even played some role in politics. And it's never that you're confronted with, easy choices. So you have to sometimes, in some senses, leave some issues alone. You can't do anything about it, even though they're crying out for some attention, because you have another problem over there that requires time and money that it be spent there. So that's just reality. It's like, in some ways, relationships as well. I mean, you have to take care about what you say to your children in terms of how you raise them. You can't speak your mind all the time. You have to care for them. You have to be gentle. Knowing how to do that, it's important. Yeah.
Even when they're terrible, you got to be nice to them.
I've come to that conclusion, Chris. Yes. I mean, I was raised with the idea that children were little horrors and that you had to discipline them terribly.
Right.
But I find late in life, because I have had a daughter late in life, that I think if you love them and don't in any way judge them, that's always the best. And always you try to, I think, state the positives in every situation. Yeah. Even though it irritates you.
Yeah. Not to compare dogs to people, but they just said the same thing about dogs and the way that they did a scientific study about the way that you treat. If you beat the dog, he'll do the thing that you want him to do, but he will just be miserable at the end of the day. And he won't do it as well. as the people that do it with love and positive reinforcement. So I agree with that. Yeah.
Yeah. No, I just picked my daughter up. She's 15. She's been in a dance festival locally, and it was competitive, and she didn't do as well. And, I suppose I could have said to her, well, if you got to bed on time last night and you hadn't been running around, you might have done much, much better this morning. But no, you just say, well, look, you did your best. You tried hard. Just enjoy the moment.
Right.
No, I think actually that's true. I think it's always better to be positive.
Yeah.
No, you can't sit back when they're about to sort of, snort some dreadful drug.
Right.
But, you have limits, but
right. Yeah, but so this plays into you're a good parent, obviously, but there's
not at all. Try to be.
There's an empathetic element to socialism. Do you think you've always been an empathetic person?
I find it difficult to say, that I'm empathetic about anything. I mean, I think that's for others to judge. I suppose I've been sensitive to the sufferings of others in some kind of smaller way.
Yeah.
I haven't always lived by that, unfortunately. But I've always had a sense of what it's like to be an outsider. Maybe it's because in some ways I've been an outsider too. You know what I mean?
Well, we were talking just before we started about an experience you had early in life. Can you share that experience of growing up in Hong Kong? I realized, I think, even as a 10-year-old living in Hong Kong, this is back in the mid-1950s, that one's life was privileged, right? I don't want to sort of indulge in a sense of guilt about being privileged, the way I think, some leftists do now engage. But, there was one occasion when I was listening into my father's friends talking one evening, and they were telling the story about a British sailor coming home from the mess. He was drunk and he knocked down a Chinese individual and killed him, and how they were explaining how that they'd arranged everything to get him off. And it struck me at the time that was a terrible, terrible thing to take place. I think that partly because my family traveled around a great deal, we were often on the edge of things, edge of other societies. We could look in, we could see, and it was possible to sort of notice the injustices that people suffered. So, I don't think one can ever say that one really responds terribly effectively to these kind of situations. But I think there's a little bit of that in me. That is, I understand, the pain of others without sounding like Bill Clinton. Yeah. I mean, and as you're growing up on the edge of other societies and sort of looking in as a kind of a military family and stuff, were there aspects of the culture that sort of crept into your, the food or the culture or something that you took with you?
Well, in some ways, I think what I did is I reacted against that military culture. It wasn't that because I was part of that military culture, my father being in the British Navy and so on, that I embraced it. Now, it was true of my brother, by the way, that he did embrace it, and he ended up in the British Army and took tours of duty in Iraq and Afghanistan and so on. Okay. I was, in some senses, the opposite. My father actually was in the Navy, and his specialty was guns, big guns on ships, right? He was actually called a Chief Ordnance Artificer. That was his title. And in a strange kind of Oedipal way, when I was 15, I came home and announced that I'd become a pacifist. Yeah.
Good for you.
No, I mean, I don't know what my father thought of that, but there it is. He didn't kick me out of the house. But at the time he was working for an aircraft company, and his job was actually to supervised the installation of guided missiles on ships.
Wow.
And the aircraft company was making guided missiles as well. Yeah.
Wow. That's intense. That's an intense life. So he didn't say anything.
No, he didn't. He didn't. Just as, and I've often wondered about this. So by the 1960s, I was living in Belfast, and there was already beginning to take place the signs of the coming Troubles. And then I went off to university in Dublin, and by then the Troubles had pretty well begun to break out.
Wow.
The IRA campaign and so on. And, at Trinity College in Dublin, I sat at the feet of some brilliant Irish historians who were very broad-minded and very open-minded about the whole Irish question. And, we took on board ideas about how that the Irish had been badly treated by the British. There was the story of the penal laws in the 18th century, so that if you were Catholic, you couldn't inherit landed property. You didn't have a vote, and those kinds of things. And I wrote a letter to the Belfast Telegraph, which was the main Protestant newspaper in Belfast. This is about 1968. And in the little letter, I said, how badly treated Irish Catholics had been. And they published it, which was quite surprising. My father saw it. He was apoplectic, but he never said a word. He was just silently seething for the rest of his life, I think. Yes.
Well, I got a hippie son who doesn't support the war effort.
Yes, that's right. Yeah. Well, of course, it was the height of the Vietnam War as well. So this although the British weren't involved in that,
right.
But it was very central to the news in Britain growing up at that time. And, one felt very sympathetic to the protest movement in the United States.
Yeah, I was going to ask you if that kind of bled over in the music and the culture of the 1960s came over there.
Yes, very much so. In fact, I think by about 1962, 63, American musical influences were coming over in their great multitudes, you know what I mean? And now, of course, there was, if you like, a British form of pop music, and you get then the coming of the Beatles, the Rolling Stones, and groups like that. And then the great explosion of British groups.
Yeah.
The tremendous hard rock groups of the 70s and 80s and so on.
Absolutely.
And in many respects, what you have now, I think, in the English-speaking world is an Anglo-American pop culture system, right?
Yeah.
So Taylor Swift lives in London, I think, and the Rolling Stones, stole all their ideas from rhythm and blues in the United States. Yeah.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah, a lot of interchange, and it's almost a kind of Atlantic culture now. Yeah.
It's a Western thing. Yeah.
It is. It's Western almost. Yeah.
One of the greatest defining principles, like the best thing that the West really did, and all of the mayhem and all of the chaos, the music, the soft power, very good, very enjoyable. And 3, 4, 5 decades from Elvis all the way till, up until the 90s, it was really good. Queen, great British export.
Oh, yes. A lot of, everyday and even working class creativity has gone into the making of popular music. And it really is a sort of an incredibly varied world. I'm a bit of an old-fashioned classical music lover. I would prefer to listen to Bach than the Beatles. Although, I love the Beatles, and, some of my friends have that special Sirius Beatles connection, that Beatles station. I don't know whether you can get it in Europe. I'm sure you can. You can get everything there. Yeah. But, yeah. I remember attending a concert in Toronto about 1971, Jefferson Airplane, Grace Slick. Lovely stuff. Lovely stuff.
Oh man, I can't believe you made it to that. That's incredible.
Yes, I did. I did. Yeah.
Yeah. That's
That's
history.
That's about the extent of my participation in pop concerts. But there you go.
Yeah.
But no, I love Queen. I think it's a sad thing that what's his name passed away.
Yeah. Freddie Mercury.
Freddie Mercury. Yeah.
Yeah.
Very creative guy. Yeah.
Wonderful voice. Yeah. Wonderful.
Yes, wonderful.
So
wonderful performer in many ways. You know
right.
what I mean?
Oh, pianist too. Great pianist.
Yes.
He could really play. But I mean, so your love of classical music, where does that come from? Because that's not very proletarian.
I think that just comes from, well, I don't know where it comes from. I do know that when I went to university, I fell in with a group of people that had what were called rooms in college, all right? Trinity College is this wonderful old college right in the middle of Dublin. It's got a high wall all around it. It's self-contained. And part of, even today, the buildings house rooms, places where students actually live. And so I fell in with a group of people who had rooms, and every day at 4:00, they served tea and they played Bach on a reel-to-reel tape recorder. And I thought I had landed in civilization. Yes.
Yeah.
I think I had, actually. So that's where I got my love of Bach, for example.
It is some kind of symbol of, intellectualism, right? Academia or intelligence.
Well, maybe it is. I mean, look, I don't know. I mean, I suppose one risks being thought a snob.
Sure.
I like what I like. I'm not asking you to like what I like. But, if I like it and enjoy it, I exult in it. And, I will continue to listen. I've heard people arguing, for example, on radio, that in fact pop music after a certain point is not subtle enough to really satisfy their taste. And they say, to gravitate to classical music,
Oh, I like that.
But I'm not sure that that's an inevitable tendency,
Not for everybody.
And there's a great beauty, don't get me wrong, there's a great beauty in classical music. I think McCartney-Lennon songs are almost as perfect as popular songs can ever be.
Yeah.
I love Leonard Cohen, at least when I'm feeling sad. I love Leonard Cohen, and I think
I liked you.
Some of his songs are perfect too. You know what I mean? You say to yourself, there could not be a better way of doing that song, or talking about that particular subject. Hallelujah, for example. Right? Suzanne.
Yeah.
Immaculate popular songs.
Yeah. Yeah, the Stranger song. Great song.
Mm-hmm.
But yeah, it's a mood. It's a mood, right? I think there's music.
Well, it's true. Yeah.
Music for every mood. But so as far as classical composers besides Bach, who else do you kind of draw on?
Well, I love Beethoven. I love particularly his string quartets, his chamber works in general. I've tried to teach myself to like what I call modern classical composers.
Okay.
I love Gustav Mahler. I love Stravinsky. I love Benjamin Britten. He was from the 50s and 60s.
Any Debussy?
Yes, I like him too. He was not a nice man, but he was a great composer.
I didn't know that.
He was a very bad-tempered fellow, and I think he treated women very badly.
Interesting.
Yes. But lately, it's sort of wonderful. You suddenly hear something new, and you say, oh my God. So just this week, I came across a piece of music by this fellow called Thomas Addis, A-D-E-S. He's about 50 years old, Thomas Addis. And it's called the Dante Project. I saw it talked about in the Times of London, the newspaper, sort of new classical music. And this writer said, well, look, there's this piece, the Dante Project. You have to listen to it. I listened to it the other day and I said, "Oh my God, this is brilliant." Yeah.
I have this right now. I'm gonna check him at Thomas Addis. Have you ever heard of Fjerde Grofta? He did a piece called, he's like a Polish guy, I think. 20th century composer, did a piece called The Grand Canyon Suite.
Oh yes, of course, yes.
Oh my God, that is one of the finest pieces of 20th century, like what would you call it, contemporary classic music. There's parts of it where it sounds like it's in Monty Python where they're banging coconuts together to make it sound like there's a donkey going up a mountainside. It's incredible music. I like how we drift around here. Yeah.
Well, when talking about American composers, Samuel Barber, Adagio for Strings, it will always move you to melancholy and sadness if you ever hear it. They played it, you remember, at John F. Kennedy's funeral. Yeah. And he's not a bad composer, Samuel Barber.
I'm also a big fan of George Gershwin because this fusion of jazz and kind of stage music, there's never been anything like it, and there never will be.
I've tried to like jazz. I've tried to teach myself jazz, at least, make my ear attuned to jazz.
Yeah.
And there are times when I can, enjoy Miles Davis in the right mood, the right context. John Coltrane, Thelonious Monk. But I can't really make myself into a jazz aficionado, Many of my friends, I have a lot of Jewish friends, actually, and a lot of Jewish men of a certain age committed completely to American jazz, listening to American jazz. They really are committed to it.
Yeah.
I can't get into that space at all.
Well, you're aware of klezmer music, though, right?
Yes, I am. Yes.
So this is the bridge between the Jewish culture and jazz culture, and like the wailing clarinets. I lived in New Orleans, which is the birthplace of jazz.
Right. Yeah.
And the sound, the tempo, everything about that music, those two musics, they are so similar. It's insane. It's a wonderful mix of the two. You'll hear at any time.
Yes.
Yeah.
No, I'm prepared to, be open-minded and say, look, this is an art form too. I think a lot of pop music is cheap and vulgar, and it's just for the moment, and that's okay, that's okay. My 15-year-old daughter, she loves it. Though she's developing a sense of taste as well. So even within pop music, she knows there are things that, she won't listen to. They're beyond her. Justin Bieber, she won't have anything to do with. She used to like.
Wasn't there a time in your life when you liked something that didn't pass the challenges of time, like it didn't?
Yes, probably. I suppose the lesser Beatles music, She Loves You is hardly very, very deep, is it? That particular song. But then there's other beautiful ones. Magical Mystery Tour, Sgt. Pepper's, all of the songs on those two albums are so absolutely brilliant.
Certainly.
They really are. Yeah.
Well, when they finally left the stadium and then went into the recording studio and whatever they did drugs and then just, focused on the sound of the recording, then you had a new art form kind of existed where it was not just performing artists anymore. It was the record itself was this side one, side two, and the cover, this experience. And I'll never, so I'm a lot younger, but when I heard Sgt. Pepper for the first time and the last song where, he gets into this car accident or whatever, just, it's a visual experience. And I'll always be sold on that kind of music first. And then I'm in my old age getting into classical music.
Well, just as you can listen to Greensleeves, the famous tune Greensleeves. mean, I take it's somewhere in its origins back in the 16th century somewhere.
That's a good question.
I think if we survive long enough, 400 years from now, they'll be listening to Sgt. Pepper's.
I'm sure. I hope so.
I hope so.
The renaissance of, like we look now at statues from 300, 400 years ago and we go, yes, this was the thing. Hopefully we'll be looking at the Beatles and who knows, maybe Eddie Money and, these things Fleetwood Mac will stand the test of time. So look, you've been around the world. You've, been writing books and stuff like this. We were talking last time about J.S. Woodsworth. How did you first discover this character, J.S. Woodsworth? What was about it that struck you about J.S. Woodsworth? And give everybody an idea about, again, who this guy was.
Well, I was, I suppose, impressed to begin with by the story of his pacifism. He was the leader of Canada's first socialist party, at least a socialist party that functioned at the national level rather than the local or provincial level. And he is famous still for being the only member of the Canadian Parliament in September 1939 to vote against or speak out against the declaration of war against Nazi Germany. Canada declared war against Nazi Germany. I think it was 7 or 8 days after the British did. Our British connection meant that they saw themselves as not so much walking in lockstep with the British, but certainly being prepared to support them. They didn't declare war right away, but within 8 or 9 days they did. And Woodsworth was, in fact, the only member of his own party, which had, of course, a strong anti-war tradition, to vote against the declaration of war. And in many ways, of course, it was courageous. It sort of destroyed his own hold over his party, nonetheless. And he sort of died about 3 years later, a sort of broken man. He was making progress on many other fronts, more domestic fronts. But then when the war broke out in 1939, that became the big issue, obviously. And so he was true to his anti-war convictions in not being prepared to support even this war or even that war. Now, I happen to think that he was wrong. I think there are, in some ways, wars worth fighting and wars that are not worth fighting. So I'm not an absolutist on pacifism, the way Woodsworth was, and the way I was actually when I was that 15-year-old and spoke out against my father. That's what attracted me to him in the beginning. And I decided to look more closely at him, and I wrote this fairly extensive book about his life and his thinking and his practice, and looked at not just his view of international relations, but his recommendations for party organization, relations with the communists, developing a welfare state, talking about redistribution, building a kind of national public healthcare system and things like that.
Was he a radical in his day, considered?
Absolutely, very much so, yes. I mean, he was very much a child of a sort of establishment, in that he was the son of a Methodist minister. You know about the Methodist Church, right? It was
vaguely.
It was a breakaway from the Anglican Church in the 18th century. It was very, very influential, by the way, in the United States. And the founders of the Methodist Church, the Wesley brothers, spent a lot of time evangelizing in the United States. And I guess there are a number of universities that owe their roots to the Methodist Church, I think, in the United States.
Yeah. We have them.
But anyway, his father was a big Methodist minister who came west to Western Canada before the First World War to essentially evangelize the prairies. But it was part as well of a sort of nation-building exercise because, of course, the Canadian state was basically absorbing the Canadian prairies and making it part of a nation state from sea to sea, from Atlantic to Pacific, right? We were also trying, by the way, to keep the Americans out, right?
You meddling Canadians.
No, I mean, there was a strong movement in the United States to take over the Canadian prairies. They weren't exactly empty of people, but they were not excessively inhabited. There were indigenous peoples there. There was the Hudson Bay Company, the fur trading company, and other fur trading companies. Small local settlements, but that was all. And there was the famous war cry of the American expansionists. Was this the 1850s? 54, 40, or fight. 54, 40, or fight. To advance the United States northwards to the 54th parallel. So Canada, on a southern extent, on the prairies anyway, is at the 49th parallel. So the 54th parallel was a good way north of where the border is now. So, all right. So Woodsworth's father was a missionary, building up churches, he hoped, in that part of Canada, but also creating, if you like, the new Canadian state, because behind this evangelical effort, there took place the settlement of the prairies and other kinds of things that happened. So Woodsworth's father was a sort of an establishment figure. He wasn't a king or a prince or an aristocrat, but he was part of an expansionist Canadian ruling class. Woodsworth, the son, was to go into the church, but he lost his faith and he turned instead to politics. And he was, of course, a sitting member of Parliament for Winnipeg Centre after 1921 until he died in office in 1942. So there was a kind of local thing as well. The house that he lived in Winnipeg was just about a mile away from where I live. There were all sorts of elements of his story in Winnipeg presently existing in the city. There is a big government building that's named after him and that kind of thing. But anyway, so I wrote the book about him, a book about him.
He was also a writer too. He wrote some things in his day.
Yes, he was really effectively a political journalist, among other things, a political pamphleteer. But he also, extended his argument, at least in two cases, to fairly long books. He wrote a book about immigration called Strangers Within Our Gates. And then he wrote a book, which is quite interesting, a book about the development of the modern city called My Neighbor. These are things he wrote before the First World War. Now, he was very influenced not just by British Labour people, but also by American progressives and American muckrakers, before the First World War. And, there was a fairly significant left-wing movement in the United States before 1914, and then up afterwards in the interwar years. And then in some ways it came unstuck with the Cold War, didn't it? And McCarthyism and all that kind of thing.
The Russian Revolution really put a damper on anarchists and communists in the United States.
Yes, I suppose so, insofar as the United States came to think, as the British did, that the new Russian government was an enemy rather than a friend.
But still, this westward ho kind of mentality of Canada, this was happening at the same time in America.
Yes, yeah. In fact, it happened in America somewhat earlier, didn't it?
That's what I
think, the settlers are on the move in the mid-19th century, if not a little bit earlier, going west, wagon trains, all that kind of thing. In Canada, I think it's much more a development of the late 19th, early 20th centuries.
Interesting. Yeah. Well, Canada, it's a little colder up there. You move a little slower. but you move westward anyway.
Well, when it's cold, you move faster, Irish.
Oh, really? Okay, good to know.
Yes.
Yeah.
You have to learn to keep warm. Yeah.
I learned a trick when I went to Denmark. They said, you got to keep your muscles loose because if you go like this and you tighten up and stuff, you'll freeze and you'll just fall right over.
I think that's true. Yeah.
Stay limber. Interesting guy, J.S. Woodsworth. Everybody go check him out. I mean, very, very prominent, interesting, revolutionary kind of Canadian figure.
But always a Democrat.
Never a radical communist.
Never a revolutionary in the sense of physical force revolution.
Okay. Well, we need all.
And I think his pacifism was influential there too. That anything won through force was not legitimate.
And so, let me ask you this: as far as we were talking about a war that's worth getting into, and also the idea of pacifism. So, isn't it true that we can only get into a war based on sort of the intelligence we have about it, or what's being said? And how can we make a decision in the modern world if we don't have all the facts? And then I think Germany was plunged into war off of conspiracy theories and, false information.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, no, I think it is a very real problem. And of course, the onset or the imminence of war draws its special kind of counter-information, disinformation, and so on, so that it is maybe almost in its nature something that it's hard to know the truth about, which would make one, I suppose, someone who would be terribly passive in the face of imminent war.
Yeah,
I think in the end you have to make your own judgment. Obviously, I don't think it's impossible to ever make a judgment about what might be a just war, but it's a difficult one. I agree. Yeah,
some forms of oppression are more obvious than others. And in the case of Germany, we didn't really know the extent of what was going on until it was much too late. And we'd already sort of won.
Mm-hmm.
But speaking of Europe, I mean, you spent time also in post-communist Czechoslovakia, or what they call Czechia now. Wonderful country with a lot of rich history and delicious liqueurs. What was it like for you to study that? And what did you write about it?
Well, I think I had a lucky chance to go teach in Prague in 1992. A professor there, after the wall came down, and communism fell, he decided he was teaching in American studies, strangely, under the communists. What could he do to somehow sustain his life in the new order? And he imagined this Canadian studies program. And he got money for it from the Canadian Embassy, I believe. And part of it was to bring in visiting lecturers every now and then. So I was one of those. So I went there, and I think, have you been to Prague at all?
I've been around it, but I haven't been to it.
Okay, well, if you go there, it has just this wonderful atmosphere of, what do you want to call it? It's the buildings, they are so evocative of history, of styles, of brilliant realizations of architectural gems, It's a place of incredible history, both brilliant and sad. I found it, to be honest, without going into it in any great depth, an incredibly erotic place.
Yeah. I mean, the historical architecture of this place, does it have a name? Is it Gothic, or what is, do you know?
Well, it's everything, Chris. It's everything from medieval through Gothic, Baroque, wonderful modern forms of architecture. I think of Art Nouveau, what they call in German Jugendstil. Wonderful instances of that in Prague from the 19 teens and 20s and 30s. And, some of the contemporary architecture isn't bad. Frank Gehry has put up a couple of buildings in Prague.
The one that's bent, it's bent at an angle or something. It looks like
yes.
Somebody
I think it's called the Laughing Building. I think it is. It's sort of in a strange kind of sort of meandering shape. Yes.
Yeah.
No, and I think that I find Czech people very engaging. They're gentle people. They've been sort of oppressed a great deal by their neighbors for a long, long time. They've become very patient. They put up with a lot. And I just find them very, very open and warm. I don't know why that is, but that's how I found them.
Yeah.
So I just fell in love with the city. Yeah.
I have had friends. I had a friend come visit me who went there, had an excellent time. He just could not be happier about it. He's so much so that he went home and he's working on getting his Czech citizenship. So we're rooting for him to get that. And he also brought us some very fine, I think it's anise or black licorice kind of liqueur. And I tried to pronounce it. I would do a terrible job, but it is so delicious. And it's slightly cheaper. So the next time I go on vacation, I'm going east.
Okay, well, do that. It's well worth it. Yeah.
So other than that, I mean, you wrote historically, what is their background as far as what have they been through in the last 150 years or 100 years?
Well, they've been through a rather lot. Well, actually, if you just extend the time period, say the last 150 years, I mean, it's all about, in some senses, the Czech revival. For a long, long time, you remember the dominant language, even of Prague, was German. And then there begins to take place in the 19th century, mid-late 19th century, a kind of Czech national revival, an interest in Czech culture, Czech language, Czech, cultural forms. And then the sort of tension, particularly with the internal German population in the city and around the Czech lands. They take part in the First World War, of course, as part of the Habsburg Empire. But then they gain their independence in 1819. They have the period of the First Republic under Masaryk. It's a functioning liberal democracy. Doesn't do too badly. But anyway, of course, it becomes a victim of Hitler's expansionism. There was always a German-speaking minority, not just in the cities, but also around the edges of the Czech lands, the so-called the Sudetenland. And, of course, Hitler appealed to the German-speaking population, come join us in a greater Germany. And, of course, that is the basis of the Munich Agreement in 1938. The Czechs have to give up that German-speaking area in return for Hitler agreeing not to destroy them, right? Then Hitler decides he won't even agree with that particular agreement, and in March 1939, he invades Czechoslovakia completely and installs a German Nazi regime in Prague. So, for the full extent of the Second World War, they are under Nazi control with all sorts of horrid things. Think about the famous destruction of the little village of Lidice. I don't know whether you know that story. You remember when the German overlord Heydrich was assassinated in Prague in 1942. The Nazis were good at revenge and retribution if they thought you'd done something wrong. And they actually took a small Czech village and killed all the men, took them all out and killed all the men, They took the women and placed them in concentration camps, and the children they put up for adoption to German families. And then they literally razed the whole town, flattened it. So that was some of the stuff that went on. And then, of course, they're liberated almost exactly, 77, 78 years ago, spring of 1945. Then there's a 3-year hiatus. And then the communists, who were very popular after the war in Czech Republic, or Czechoslovakia, they decided that they couldn't put up with any other competition, and so they undertook a coup in February 1948. And so you get the period of communism from then until, 1989, 1990, and the fall of communism, the fall of the wall in Berlin, and that kind of thing. Yeah. So they've gone through an incredible number of regime changes. If you were, let's say, born in 1910 or 1914, you would have gone through 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 at least regimes in the last 100 years. A quite incredible change.
How did they fare during the times of being a part of the communist bloc?
Well, they were part of the industrial base of the whole Soviet system, right? A lot of industry in Prague and in Czech Republic in general. We call it Czechoslovakia then, don't we? It was like East Germany. There was certain kinds of industrial activities that the East Germans undertook as part of the wider communist system. But, people were regimented. There was not really great intellectual freedom. The Communist Party ruled with an iron rod. People were not terribly happy. There was the famous Prague Spring of 1968, a great resurgence of liberal opinion, even within the Communist Party. But then that's nicely squashed by the invasion by the Soviets in August 1968. And then you get the period of so-called real socialism under people like Husak and so on. Roughly what the communists tried to provide was a sort of reasonably decent minimum standard of living for everybody. And in return, they expected the population to be obedient and conformist. But it wasn't enough. And when then the grip of the Soviets over Eastern Europe began to lessen, I think there was a fairly significant and authentic uprising of people in the late fall of '89. And the communists, I suppose, had the decency to hand back the keys and let other people take over.
And so how much of the free market principles did they absorb after they finally broke away from that authoritarian kind of communism?
Well, there was of course a commitment of sorts to privatizing public property or public properties. That went ahead. And there was, a commitment to competition, private property, private ownership. The problem, as with most Eastern European countries and with the Soviet Union too, is that wherever there was capitalism, it was invariably crony capitalism with a great deal of corruption, giving us then the kind of world of the Russian oligarchs. But there are equivalent oligarchs throughout most of the Eastern European countries. So they operate in a privately owned capitalist economy, but only with tremendous advantage provided by the state. Special deals, special arrangements, sweet deals, and so on.
So I don't know.
So that's what
I don't know if this is in your wheelhouse or not. But how does the kind of crony capitalism that we definitely have in America, and that ended up coming over to Russia, how much is the Russian version of the oligarchy that they have is based on sort of our way of doing things?
Well, I wouldn't say it's an imitation of the American way. And, whatever the faults of American business, I don't think it's quite as crony capitalist as, say, the Soviet Union became under Russia, Yeltsin, and the early days of, and even continuing today, the days of Putin. There were various stories. For example, I remember talking to the fellow that became the owner of one of the important newspapers in Prague, and he was attached to likely the communist Czechoslovak secret service. He was a journalist in Washington, and almost inevitably that would make him part of their espionage system, right? And then he went back to Prague, working again for the newspaper. It was called Rudé Pravo. It was the main communist newspaper in Czechoslovakia. And he told me the story that when communism fell, people spat at him on the street when they knew that he had been a worker for the communist newspaper. But he had the special ingenuity to go down to the copyright office and take out a copyright in the name of Pravo. He called the workers in the newspaper together and said, let's set up a cooperative. Everybody put in some money. Then a few years later, he bought them out at very sort of decent prices and became the big owner of the newspaper. So he was sort of Johnny on the spot, able to take advantage of the situation. Espionage people working in hotels who were keeping their eye on foreign tourists, they were Johnny on the spot, and they got a special opportunity to buy the hotel once it was that everything became private. Are you still there, Chris?
Yeah. So do you find that?
Yeah, I've lost your visual. Your face is frozen. Okay.
Okay. Hang on.
But that's okay.
All right. So we were talking about Europe. Let's move back to Canada. You wrote a book, Citizen Trudeau, 1944 to 1965, an intellectual biography. Now, this is a book about the current president of Canada, or Prime Minister, I think, Justin Trudeau's father. Is that right?
Yes, that's right. Mm-hmm.
So what prompted you to want to write a book about this particular fella?
Well, he has been or was Prime Minister for a large part of my life, living in Canada. I had, loves and hates towards him in different respects. But I came to the conclusion when he retired in 1984 that he was one of the most brilliant politicians there had been in Canada. And that he was as well the kind of politician that I admire very much. That is to say, a politician who is not just practically successful, but also based his practical activity on some kind of deep intellectual understanding of the world. That he was, in other words, an intellectual in politics. And I happen to think, that that's the best kind of politician. Maybe not. You could make the case, I think you could make the case sometimes for people who are not, not very intellectually gifted, but have a sort of shrewd, worldly common sense,
Oh, yeah.
I'm trying to think.
Absolutely.
Maybe Eisenhower is like that. I don't know.
Yeah. When he talked out against the military-industrial complex, he wasn't a bright guy, but he at least saw the common sense.
He saw certain things. Yes. You can see politics as being a very sort of special activity that you only sort of know how to do if you immerse yourself in it and actually practice it for some length of time, and that when you then have obtained this experience, you can become maybe a brilliant politician, a brilliant practitioner of the system that you've been raised in. Now, that's in opposition to the idea of the brilliant brain, the brilliant mind that knows what's right for everything,
right,
and comes from outside and says, here's how we're going to do it, right? I think, in fact, if there's a choice between those two types, I would prefer the practical politician as opposed to the utopian intellectual, right?
Right.
But I think Pierre Trudeau was a mixture of the two, and that's, I think, the best kind of politician to have. He was informed, he was intelligent, he was innovative. He had a brilliant mind as well as a good sense of what was possible.
So let's dive in. What were some of the tenets that he had that was his core, and what were the kind of strategies he used to make them become a reality?
Well, people who think well of Trudeau will say the one important thing that he did was change the Constitution in 1982 to include then an entrenched Charter of Rights and Freedoms. In many respects, a kind of imitation of the American Bill of Rights. Now, I don't know where you stand on the American Bill of Rights, but many people will say that, if you have a court system that applies the rule of law, that is not corrupt, or at least is sufficiently uncorrupted, let's put it that way. And if you have a Bill of Rights that it can apply, then this is hugely significant in terms of protecting particularly individual and minority rights. And that was a position that Trudeau had had all his life. And, making change in Canada is not easy because you've got to deal with 10 provinces as well as a federal government. The same problem you have in the States. You have a federal system, so you have many state governments. Hard to coordinate them. And of course, it's very hard to make change then.
Yeah.
But Trudeau managed to insist that we must have a Charter of Rights. And he brought the provinces along sufficiently to get them to agree to the kind of version of a Bill of Rights that we now have. And that was, I think, a huge achievement. And out of that has come, all sorts of initiatives. So, for example, I suppose we have gay rights in this country because of the Charter of Rights and Freedoms. If we have abortion rights, sensible abortion rights in this country, it's because of the Charter. Back in 1988, I think it is, some activists took the existing criminal law forbidding abortion to the Supreme Court, and the Supreme Court concluded that it was contrary to the Charter of Rights. And so the law forbidding abortion was declared null and void, and it was that we now have abortion rights in this country. Yeah.
So going back to this man's upbringing, what made him so empathetic towards these minority groups, or what kind of crafted him into being the character that he was as a politician?
Well, that's a very good question. And, like a lot of explanations of individuals' commitments to a particular political position, it's often hard to know what really was the factor that influenced him. Just to say that Trudeau was the product of a mixed family. His father was French-Canadian, and his mother was English-Canadian. So there, if you like, we have a melding of the two important national groups in this country. He was a world traveler. He was incredibly cosmopolitan. He was a student at the London School of Economics in 1948. And then when he finished in 1949, he went on a world trip, basically backpacking, literally, for 10 months, all the way from London, east into the Middle East, down through India, down through Malaysia, into Indochina, and then ending up then in Shanghai, in China. So for 10 months he traveled. Almost every year thereafter, he was a world traveler, to Africa, Asia, all places. Now, he became a socialist of sorts, I think, around about 1948, 49. He was never a Marxist, but he took the view in the early 1950s that the world was unacceptably polarized. This is the period of the Cold War, between particularly the United States and the Soviet Union, and that what we should try to do was to build bridges, build, if you like, intermediary institutions, alliances of non-aligned countries, that kind of thing. And he took very much the view that he should try and be a sort of go-between between West and East, between capitalism and communism. He attended, for example, a very famous conference in Moscow in 1952. He thought it was important, as early as that, to ensure that conflict between the Soviet Union and America should not get out of hand. He was a very strong believer very early on of the evils of nuclear weapons, and wanted to think about how we could live in a non-nuclear world. So there's some of his positions in the 1950s, left-wing, socialist, anti-nationalist, strenuously anti-nationalist. Okay. The problem, he says, of nationalism is that it takes the majority ethnicity of a country and makes it the nation state and the only legitimate dominant identity. And of course, the victims of that kind of system are minorities, ethnic minorities, racial minorities, and so on.
Yeah.
So the virtue of a Bill of Rights, a Charter of Rights, is that it allows some kind of minority rights to be protected and to be adjudicated. So anyway, then he was elected in 1968, and he was pretty well in power, uninterrupted between 1968 and 1984.
Did he bend or waver with his ideologies as he got older, or what was he always sort of trying to be as empathetic and sort of radical the whole time?
Well, he was very early on a pragmatist. I mean, it's very, very interesting. When I began to study him, I got into his personal papers in the archives in Ottawa, and one of the first things that I came across was an essay he wrote at Harvard in 1946. All right, he went to study an MA at Harvard, and he wrote a big long paper about political violence, and he took as one of his influences John Dewey, the American pragmatist. Okay. So Dewey and people like that, the American pragmatists, thought that the truth of any position was not its intellectual coherence, but its practical effect. Okay? If you're talking politically,
right.
There's no point in believing in something if it's totally impossible, right?
Right.
Only if something can have an effect in the real world is it worth pursuing.
Yeah.
So that's pragmatism. And in this essay, it's clear that Trudeau was actually showing that he was pragmatic already.
Yeah.
So his position is a mixture of two things. Understanding deeply the nature of the political world as much as he could, while also understanding that, the true test of some political virtue was its practical implementation.
Only push forward the rocks that you know you are strong enough to push. Don't.
Yes. Well, if you want to put it like that, that's well put, Chris. I think. Yeah.
And I'm not yet a pragmatist, but I know that pragmatists are right.
Mm-hmm.
But seeing grand, sweeping, glaring, an uncountable amount of problems with humanity itself, it makes me that way. I go, oh well, we got so much to do, and that's the essence of politics. So you study political science. What are the other sort of aspects of what we were just talking about? Is What is the ultimate goal? I mean, you have to use a certain amount of rhetoric, right, to achieve an ends to a means. So there's a certain amount of manipulation of the public, but then there's also a need to push forward legislation, whether it be in the interests of industrialists or the interests of the working class or poor people. What else are the ingredients to good politics?
Well, that's a big question.
Sorry, I'm sorry.
No. Actually, Max Weber wrote a wonderful essay on politics, and one of the things that he tried to say was that politics is like having to sort of, cut through deep boards of resistance. Right? It's a tough activity. There's huge resistance all the time. The ship of state moves only slowly, and if you want to change its direction, it takes a long effort. So you have to be persistent. You have to have that part of your personality that takes, can absorb disappointment, I think. But I think you also have to have a creative mind sufficient to see what the larger picture is, and how you can see steps you can take within it to make some kind of change that will hopefully improve people's circumstances. I think the difficulty of politics is that it's open to fair amounts of corruption, because to make change, you have to have power. And when you have power, you can't resist possibly, using it to your own advantage. Yeah. So corruption is always a problem with politics. It is that as well, to try and stay on top of the many complexities of running a society, it's hard to be intellectually consistent all the time. So how can you be always truthful and consistent while being a politician? Sometimes you have to make compromises. Is a compromise a form of dishonesty? Is it? I don't know. A little bit sometimes. Yeah. A lot of the time, it can be a great deal. Yeah. Back to Mr. Woodsworth, so he gets a chance to talk to the Prime Minister in 1926 and says, I'll give you my party's support, all two of us, if you give us an old age pension program. And the Prime Minister says, well, I'll do the best I can. I won't be able to do it immediately. And, I'll have to get the provinces supporting it. And it'll only be above 75 years old. And Woodsworth says, it's enough. Give it to me and I'll support you. Okay.
Right.
So you're embracing something that's incomplete, inadequate, imperfect, but it is better than what you have. So let's do it.
And what it definitely symbolizes to the people that change is happening.
Yes, and you can build on it. I mean, there's a wonderful French phrase called étapisme, making steps. Yeah, taking steps to make change. Étapisme.
This is a wisdom I'm just now learning, and this is what I'm employing with my podcast here. Every day, just have a new, wonderful human being come on and just keep going and see what happens. Mm-hmm. Build on it. So we did an hour and 20 minutes. How do you feel?
Well, I'm sort of tiring, I think.
Yeah.
But I could go a little bit longer if you want to. If you want to finish off more on Trudeau, we could wrap it up then.
Let's wrap it up. Let's do another 10 minutes, 15 minutes, whatever you want to do. Look, the time
That's good. 10 minutes will be good.
By the way, it's great to have you, man. You are a wonderful mind, an inspiration to talk to, just all around a wonderful human being. So tell us more about Trudeau and then kind of how we drifted into his son and tell us a little bit about his son as well.
Well, I mean, I'll get to the son. The father is very, very interesting because pretty well until his early 50s, he was unmarried. And we now know that he had wonderful affairs with different women. He really did love women, I think, although the rumor went around when he first ran in 1968 as Prime Minister of Canada that he was, as they called it then, homosexual. But there you go. This is the dirty side of politics.
Oh, I love it.
But he had this sort of wonderful life. He did have a brilliant mind. He wrote a great deal. He was an excellent journalist, but he also turned his hand to writing books. He wrote a book about visiting China in 1960-61, and so on. But then he decided in 1965 that the country was at risk of breaking up because of the rise of separatism in Quebec. And he ran for the Liberal Party and was elected. And then in very short order became Prime Minister. But he had this sort of wonderful civilized style. He was genial and conversant and knew how to talk about everything. And he drove around in a Mercedes sports car just as he'd ridden on a motorbike when he was younger. He had this wonderful, incredible lifestyle. He was very attractive on many counts, not just intellectually, politically, but personally. Anyway, he finally married in 1971, I think it was. And he married a young, beautiful woman, Margaret Sinclair, who was, I think, at the time, about 30 years younger than him. Then he started, they turned to having a family. And Justin was their firstborn son, who was born, I think it was, on Christmas Day in 1972. The marriage didn't survive. Now, Margaret has gone on record as suffering from bipolar disorder. She has admitted to that or conceded that. And she was a bit of a wild child, I must say. By the end of the marriage, she was running off to Toronto to hang out with the Rolling Stones. That's a true story. That's a true story, Chris.
Oh, man, that's going in yeah.
She probably had an affair with Teddy Kennedy. If that's a good or a bad thing, I don't know.
Hey, you only live once, you know?
You only live once. Teddy Kennedy thought so too. Yes. Anyway, Margaret gave birth to 3 boys, one of whom died very tragically in an avalanche in British Columbia when he was about 18 or 19. The marriage broke up about 10 years into its existence, and Trudeau was basically unmarried for the rest of his life, although he had other girlfriends, and indeed he fathered another child, a daughter, with a colleague of his who helped him on some political campaigns after he retired. So there was always a little bit of the unconventional about Trudeau. He was very much his own man. Justin was raised with his other brothers in this splendid mansion that Trudeau lived in Montreal. Trudeau, I believe, was a very stern, disciplined parent, so Justin would not have had an easy time. But, Justin was raised in this very special household by a very special father and, had a very good education. He had a certain kind of charisma too. He entered politics and became Liberal Party leader. And, 8 years ago, he became Prime Minister. So there he is.
I once saw a video of him falling down some stairs as a practical joke, and I'll never forget. I can't envision him in any other light other than as kind of a college frat guy with a pretty good sense of humor. But it's very, very interesting because Trudeau was like that. He
he fell in with a group of friends when he was a student in Montreal. And their role in life, among other things, was to sort of surprise people with various kinds of gags, you know what I mean? Going off to a public meeting and pulling out an imitation gun and firing it. Supposedly he rode around Quebec during the Second World War on his motorbike, wearing it wasn't a Nazi helmet, it was a First World War Prussian helmet. You know, the ones with the spikes
with the spike.
on it.
You're right. Yeah.
He was a free spirit ahead of his time. Now, he was able to do that because his father was very wealthy. His father was a lawyer. This is Pierre Trudeau, Justin's grandfather. His father was Justin's grandfather. What was he called? I can't remember his first name. I must try and remember. But anyway, he was a lawyer that had this idea in the 1920s of putting together a string of gas stations on Montreal Island. And he was bought out by Imperial Oil in the early 1930s for, I think it was $1.2 million, which was a fabulous sum of money in the Depression. So Trudeau, because his father died quite young, Trudeau was 15 when his father died, and Trudeau then inherited or helped inherit the family fortune. So he was always independently wealthy, and he could go wherever he wanted, at no expense. Mm-hmm. So, he had the special kind of appurtenances of wealth. He drove a Mercedes sports car back in the 1950s. He had specially Italian designed suits and things. He got a reputation as a playboy, which I think was unfair. He was very disciplined intellectually and personally, but he sort of liked the good life as well, travel.
Yeah. Charles Emile.
Pardon?
Charles Emile.
Yes, okay, Charles, that's his father's name. Yeah. So Justin is his grandfather, is the grandson of Charles. And, he's been, I think, a not bad Prime Minister of Canada. He has been victimized, I think, by elements of a kind of Trumpist political culture, which has jumped the border and come to Canada. Mm-hmm. So that when you hate people or you disagree with people politically, you hate them.
Oh, yeah.
You hate them.
And
you demonize them.
I've never been, but don't go to Hamilton. This is what my experience is. Hamilton's a hot spot for this kind of thing.
Now, Hamilton, Canada, are you talking about?
Yeah, absolutely. I've heard that there is a hotbed of sort of right-wing people there.
Well, the present Conservative leader, Poilievre, in some ways is a bit of a Trumpist, in my view. He tries to moderate it now because he knows there are parts of the, society in Canada that doesn't like this very much. But we had this big truck convoy that occupied the capital city for several weeks back in last winter. I don't know whether you knew much about this.
I heard about it a little bit.
But the people behind it were, in many respects, Trumpists. The problem, I think, is that a lot of Canadians now are tuned into American social media.
Yeah.
So the conspiracy theories of the QAnon stuff and stuff like that.
Oh, yeah.
Have leapt the border, and they are now part of the fringe of the Conservative Party.
I can say that being here in Europe, there are Germans that are, my neighbor here in Germany was swept up, mm-hmm. Lost in a tornado of conspiracy theories. Mm-hmm. We hope that it's like having somebody in a coma. It's like you hope that they come out of it. You don't know. Maybe they will, maybe they won't.
Yeah, I think that's an interesting way of putting it, Chris, in a coma. No, I remember, I got to know an older fellow. He did a lot of work on my house, and we were fairly close. And one day we got to talking about serious politics, and he told me that he supported Trump. He was right, I couldn't believe it.
If you love to watch a burning building, yeah, I mean, that's a good candidate.
Yeah.
And to some extent, I mean, I'm not really much for the neoliberal model either because of the inherent, profit motive economics. I think it's just completely, it's not compatible with the environmental concerns that we have. So I'm thinking we need to do something completely different, other than that. But again, this is like a huge overhaul we're talking. But on the other side, I don't know what these people are thinking. I really don't know.
Well, the worries that I have are that, the people that support Trump are really, in some senses, interested in destruction and chaos. I mean, they seem to have it as their ruling principle that none of the institutions that we've developed make any sense to them, and indeed are considered to be evil things.
Yeah.
And in the end, when you start thinking about it, maybe there is something important about having a rule of law judiciary, for example. Yeah. Maybe it is that if you have a democratically elected Congress that can disagree about important things, maybe that's worth having too,
Yeah.
And they seem to have picked on certain kind of minorities. Well, of course, it's sort of implicit alliance with white racism in the States.
Yeah.
That's very worrisome. Yeah.
Well, the playbook is always find a minority group in times of economic distress and make them the boogeyman, while we reshuffle kind of our seats up at the top. But I agree 100% because these people who come from rural places who don't understand the nuances of how our systems work, they are just say things like these elitists, which is like anybody that went to university is an elitist. So it's like basically like smart people, we don't want them. We hate them.
Well, no, I mean, it's very hard to think about the two parts of the United States. And you can take a very sophisticated part of America, let's say Boston, in the neighborhood of Harvard. I mean, I've been to Boston and it's a very sophisticated place. And then you think about, rural Texas or rural Oklahoma and pulling into a sort of diner in some small town, and you think about, what's the culture like there, and right. It's light years away from Boston.
One of the strong points of the life that I've lived hitchhiking across America as like a musician for years, for about over 10 years, just doing this kind of round around, sort of around the world in a way, but within the United States is the differences between these places is so vast. You're absolutely right. There is no connection for these people.
Do you think there would be some kind of notional unity in their sort of common commitment to the United States as a democratic country, believing in rights, and so on? But that's all gotten sort of destroyed, I think, and I don't know what's done it, but I think social media has a lot to answer for.
Sure. But I think it's also individualism as at the heart of like consumer capitalist culture, which makes it the me kind of attitude. So when it comes to rural people talking about people from New York, they say, well, forget those people. It's all about me, rather than saying this is America. This is New York City is America. So, and the infighting, just like the Civil War, is that really patriotic? Is that really, because I think it has something to do with the economic system being so oriented around isolation and keeping up with the Joneses. I don't know if you've heard that expression.
Sure, of course. Yes.
Yeah. I don't know how you feel about that.
Well, I mean, part of my pragmatism is that if capitalism can be slightly moralized, I go for it. You know
sure.
what I mean?
I mean, me too. Yeah.
I mean, I'd rather have Bill Gates than the Pillow Man, for example, right?
Right.
The one of Trump's supporters. I'd rather have Bill Gates than the Pillow Man.
The Pillow Man.
I'd rather have Bill Gates than Elon Musk.
That's true too. Yeah.
I think Elon Musk is a potentially very dangerous fellow.
Whose rhetoric gets worse and worse every day. It's like
yes, it does.
At first he was innocuous, and now he is the wealthiest man in the world, and also very giving fascist kind of dog whistles.
Yes. I know what you mean. Yeah.
Well, we'll just have to wait and see what happens.
And now he has his own propaganda machine too.
I know. Well, you have to buy it, like Rupert Murdoch. He bought his. If you can afford it. This goes back to the industrialists of the last century. We already did this. I've seen this movie. Yeah. Well, you come back. Let's talk politics again. We'll dig up the stories of the day and we'll analyze them because you are a great mind and a great human being to speak with. Did you want to add anything before we go?
Not at all. I've just enjoyed chatting with you, Chris, and I wish you well in your project of being a podcaster.
Yeah. It's something to
Lots of competition. Lots of competition.
Yeah, unfortunately. But you know what? It's so cathartic that if nobody sees it, I'm still happy, right?
Well, it's the same about my writing of my books. I mean, I haven't made much money. They haven't sold terribly a lot. But I feel as if at least the books are out there. They're in libraries. Some have read them, but not many. I mean, they haven't been bestsellers. But I'm glad to have done them. And that's enough for me. Yeah.
Well, we get together and we put our powers together. I know last time we got, a fairly good size number of people came and listened to our chat. People that were interested in Canadian socialism came by. So with a bit of luck, we'll keep it up and we'll keep pushing it out. And by the way, the links to Alan Mills's book will be in the description. If anybody's out there watching wants to check out some of these amazing works that he's done. Yeah, he'll come back. He'll do it again. I want to thank you, Professor Alan Mills, Ph.D.
Okay, Chris.
We'll sign off to everybody. See you guys. See you next time. Bye-bye.
Auf